former minister and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Fransson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Tonight's episode: Liberty and Justice of Economic Equilibrium.
Hello, everyone. It's Tuesday night, time for Created in the Image of God, the role of religion in society. Tonight, we have a returning guest to wrap up and conclude his series that he's been giving over the last number of months on economics. And it's a particular view of economics, one that is inspired by the holy writings, inspired by divine wisdom. Tonight's topic: liberty and justice of economic equilibrium. Let's bring Bruce Koerber back into the studio. Welcome, Bruce. How are you this evening?
I'm great. I'm doing good, Wade. How are you? I'm sorry we had the technical difficulties, but we're rolling.
It's always something. What Bruce is referring to is me futzing around with different software programs to try to get his images that he had sent over in advance in the right size and in the right tool in order to present them to you tonight. One thing about technology that I have come to understand over the years, and by the way, my family and I just got new iPhones here over Thanksgiving. You know, we switched from Verizon to AT&T because of the special deal at Costco that the whole family got new iPhones. Now there's economics at work. My cat, my daughter's cat, Licorice, likes to come join me when I sit in my chair here and wants to be in on the action. So anyway, about technology, anytime, no matter how well designed, and certainly Apple makes great products from the perspective that they are powerful, intuitive. When that first iPhone came out, it almost seemed like magic the way it worked. It was so powerful. But anytime you use a new technology, no matter how well designed, it makes us temporarily incompetent, as we have where all the switches are and how this works. And I'm trying to import files from my Google Drive, and it seemed to work, but then I couldn't drag them over, and yada, yada, yada. So somehow we managed to get that done right before going live. That's what Bruce was referring to with technical difficulties. They were all on my side tonight. So Bruce, we have you back in the studio, and this is the fifth episode. We've gone through microeconomics, macroeconomics. We've covered your divine economy model, and give us a sort of a summary and a foretaste of what we have in store for us tonight.
Okay, so this book, Liberty and Justice of Economic Equilibrium, trains you to be an assayer, to detect impurities and corruption, to identify those elements that add value, and declare what it is that brings about wealth. That's what its purpose is and its potential is. So the ideal for everything, for society, is to have a contractual society, and the divine economy is a perfect blend of both liberty and justice.
Wonderful. Now, taking a step back from, I'm going to say, mere economics, though I know that in your view, economics holds a very, very high station, if you will. But my point being, taking a big step back, God, the creator of all things, works through contracts, does he not? And these are called covenants.
Right.
And there's in the Baha'i faith, in the Baha'i teachings, there's something called the eternal covenant. Is it the great covenant? Share with us your view on what that is, Bruce, at that sort of highest level, how God works with humanity.
Well, I think the greater covenant is speaking of the fact that God will never leave us to ourselves, that he always will guide us. And that's a promise. And then our end of the deal is to abide by the laws and the teachings that are provided, and to love one another.
I have my grounding really in sort of a unique Christian view, one that was very well grounded in the Old Testament. And I remember Deuteronomy 30 and this profound statement that's so simple and yet so powerful, where God says through Moses at that time, I set before you life and death. Therefore choose life, that you and your children may live. And elsewhere, Jesus says, I came not to give life, but life more abundantly. Right? So the promise of God, the covenant of God, is that abide in harmony with his law.
Definitely.
And you will achieve a wealth and a richness and a wealth, if you will. I don't mean to promote some what's been called the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel. Do these things and God will make you rich. No, it's not really that. But just wealth, prosperity, health, happiness, unimaginable, by living in accordance with the divine will, with the divine law. And I've said many times on this program, God put the greater and lesser lights in heaven to rule the night and the day. And when we submit to the light, we attain and retain our sovereignty. And when we succumb to any form of darkness, we become enslaved, and we enslave each other.
Yeah.
These are fundamental foundational principles of the divine will, of the expression, the manifestation of God. And of course, this planet, this blue-green jewel floating through space on which we abide, the garden, if you will, that we are asked to dress and keep, holds forth unimaginable promise. It's such a beautiful existence that we're offered.
Well, that enslaving you mentioned is the opposite of justice and liberty, because justice is what protects the human reality, and liberty allows for the expression of the human reality. Justice is the step to objectify the ethics that protects the subjective qualities of human action. And justice is a known concept because it's either present or it's absent. And therefore, because of that, it can be perceived. And that which promotes social cooperation among everyone is, in the long run, is what is just.
So I'm going to go ahead and read real quick something you're very familiar with by way of intro here. It's the second hidden word of Baha'u'llah, right? O Son of Spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if you desire me, and neglect it not. And I love this part. I mean, I love every word here, but I love this part. Neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. Right? And this is that guidance, this promise, this covenant that God will never leave us nor forsake us, again, as it says in the Old Testament. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And this is the promise that God gave to Joshua when Moses, when the mantle of Moses was conferred upon him. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Be of strong courage. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And of course, that applies to any and all of us. Neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. So by applying our mind, our spirit, our heart towards this idea of justice and seeking it out, setting it before our eyes as the best beloved of God, God then confides in us, guides us, helps us to achieve and attain that justice. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shall know of thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. One of the challenges of this world today and of society is everyone virtue signaling and telling us what is right and what is wrong, what to believe, who to vote for, who not to vote for. The media spinning every imaginable situation and incident to change the views and the opinions of others. But here we're told, you shall see it through thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others. Shalt know of thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in thy heart, which is what we're doing right now openly, pondering it, thinking about it, reflecting on it. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. Each one of us looking at ourselves. Verily, justice is my gift to thee and the sign of my loving kindness. Do we think of justice as a sign of loving kindness? Set it then before thine eyes. All right, so those are some thoughts on justice. Let's dive into your material, Bruce.
Okay.
So take us through tonight's, material message.
The underlying message the whole time is the harmony of science and religion. Okay, so the human sciences, there's a certain inseparability between economics and ethics, between liberty and justice, and between law and order. Those are all encompassing, and they're all interconnected. And that's the thing about the sciences and the religion, and science and religion being in harmony. All these things are all part of the same creation, and we're trying to figure out where we fit in that. But there's no way really to separate them completely, because they're intertwined.
Awesome. Well, let me, we've got a returning person in the audience, and I want to honor that real quick.
Okay.
A question here from Olga, and welcome back, Olga. Thank you for joining the show again tonight. So it's such a pleasure to see you. What is the connection between submitting to the light and individual sovereignty? Well, I'm going to share my view, share another hidden word, and then invite you to also respond to this, Bruce. So we're created in the image of God. And in the creation story in the Bible, God created Adam from the dust of the earth. And then he put him in the garden and told Adam to dress and keep it. That was the purpose for which we're here. And I'm by metaphor, I'm saying the garden is the whole planet, this jewel floating through space. It is the Garden of Eden when looked at from a cosmic perspective. The whole planet is the Garden of Eden in that sense. Okay. Now, further in the Bible, God reveals that we are the crowning achievement of his physical creation. We are the keystone of the physical creation. We're the king of the beasts, if you will. And God specifically says he put all things under our feet. This whole planet, he put a governor on it. Later in the book of Genesis, we learn about Nimrod building this tower to heaven, and God says no, basically telling us that our sovereignty extends around this planet, but not yet into space. And again, the Bible verses reveal later, I have put all things under your feet, but not yet all things, and that we were made lower than the angels, for example. So there's a spiritual plane and there's a material plane, but on the material plane, we're the king, we're the master of that creation. So we are sovereign on the earth. There's nothing above us on earth. We can master all the physical elements. We can, overcome all the other animals, and we have done so. We have become the supreme species of this planet. And then it says he created us in his image and likeness. So we have that same divine capacity. And then it says he created us male and female. So the man and the woman are both sovereign. And the intent was not that one would serve the other, but that they would be equally sovereign. So that's where I say individual sovereignty is divinely ordained. And the first time the word rule is used, this idea of, well, should somebody rule over anybody else? No. The first time the word rule is used in the Bible, it is the placing of the greater and lesser light in heaven to rule what? The day and the night. And so that light is the ruling element, and we must submit to that ruling element. We must submit to that ruling element, the light. And that's where I come from on this. So the other hidden word, the first hidden word, in case you're familiar with this, I don't know, Olga, but O son of spirit, my first counsel is this: possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thine may be a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. So I said I'll give this over to you, Bruce, and I will, but I want to just, here's Olga's follow-up comment. We are the planet's cancer. I often joke that the first commandment is dress and keep the garden. The second commandment is be fruitful and multiply. That is literally the first two statements from God about our purpose: dress and keep the garden, and the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. So we became the most invasive species the world has ever seen, right? And in that sense, yes, we have the potential of being a cancer, but that is because our hearts are not pure. Possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thine may be a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. If we don't, it's true, we have the power to destroy the whole planet. We could do it. Could happen. The question is, will we? Are we really doing that? Or are we checking ourselves? Are we self-governing? Are we submitting to the light? All right, Bruce, over to you to comment.
Well, I think that that's the whole way that a person is sovereign, is by submitting to the light, because that's where God is sovereign. So we're created in His image. So when we accept it and submit to it, then that is how we become. So that is our sovereign, our individual sovereignty is submitting to the light. Yes.
And we've got another returning visitor here in the audience, Makai, the Imam, who is the founder of the Interfaith Library, who, by the way, we will be featuring here in an upcoming show. We'll learn more about that later. Is quoting Micah 6, verse 8, one of my favorite Bible verses. There are many favorites, but he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And MU, I think here, I think he sent here we go. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So yes, our behavior, right? And Bruce, isn't that part of this eternal covenant that's been made with us, right? That's our part, is to fulfill those things, to live up to the purpose for which we were put on earth, as you pointed out, that submission.
That's the contract. It has two sides to it.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So back over to you then, Bruce, to take us more deeply into this.
So if it's okay with you, we'll go to the first diagram.
Absolutely. Since, as you know, we spent some time preparing for this. Let's see here if I can manage the technology. There we go.
Okay,
all
so
right,
this is basically the concept that's presented in the book. And so what you see is economic equilibrium balancing liberty and justice. So that's what's kind of balancing everything, is this economic equilibrium. And so we'll go then to the second diagram. So we go from a two-dimensional diagram to a three-dimensional diagram. And so what we see here is this plane that's at rest in its equilibrium position. We also see then the forces that help to maintain that equilibrium, and that's harmony, reciprocity, and symmetry. So economic equilibrium and the forces at work, that's what that's representing. So then we would go to the next diagram. And then in this diagram, the immense complexities that come into play in human culture. So now we're talking about the human culture. Those things that come into play in the human culture are added to provide a picture of the interconnectedness of all facets of human civilization. So you have morality and ethics, you have economy and liberty, you have order and peace, you have law and justice, and they're all being balanced in by this at this equilibrium point through harmony, reciprocity, and symmetry. And that's so the equilibrium that we're talking about, this economic equilibrium, is actually a broader than that, because there's equilibrium that's affecting the whole civilization, all aspects of civilization. And so they're all in balance. Well, they potentially all in balance. So, but here's a funny point that I want to make for you, that there's those who say that there's consequences resulting from the disruption of the ecological system. So even to the extent that the flapping of a butterfly wing is felt around the world, and yet there's very little thought given to the consequences of the major and continuous human disruptions to the equilibrium that is operative in human civilization. So they're talking about, the butterfly wheel, but butterfly wings, but nobody's talking about all the disruptions to equilibrium that's happening through intervention, for instance. So,
well, yeah, it's interesting as you bring that up, right? And it's the butterfly effect, right? The flapping of a butterfly wing on one side of the planet can cause a hurricane. That's kind of the statement, and in some sense maybe there's some truth to that, but then you have decisions that are made by incredibly powerful entities, right? That have the effect immediately of a hurricane. So on the one hand, you have the flapping of a butterfly's wing, which is almost imperceptible. Then you have a hurricane. Well, if a butterfly wing can cause a hurricane, then what can a hurricane cause?
Right? Or bombs being dropped.
Right. There's a verse in the Bible that comes to mind now, and that is that they have sown the wind and they will reap the whirlwind.
Yeah.
Right. So the seed that was planted was the wind, but what they will reap is the whirlwind. It's the same basic principle, right? That when this thing grows up, when the outcomes are known, when the forces that were set in motion have done their work, it will not be pretty.
Yeah. That just goes to emphasize how significant it is that we pay attention and try to figure out, how to resolve these issues, because they're having serious consequences for us in the future and what we've done in the past. It's all related to our interference with God's creation. So
well, and I'd like to bring up another analogy in this regard.
Okay.
Many people may not know, for example, actually, for those who are aware of this biblical analogy, again, going back to the book of Genesis, you've got the serpent, right? The serpent who whispered to Eve and said, "What is God's lying to you? He's trying to withhold something good from you. You should go and take of that fruit. God knows that in the day you eat of that fruit, your eyes will be opened and you will become like God. And you will be wise, knowing the difference between good and evil." And Eve's desire led her to take of that fruit. And I've shared on this show how it's my belief that ultimately it was our destiny to take of that fruit. It's just that we were supposed to do it under God's guidance. We were supposed to mature and ripen in our own way over time, and not precipitously rush headlong with heedlessness, with our own strong-willed, insistent self and our desires, causing havoc. But the point is, the serpent was the whisperer. The serpent had the ability to influence Eve. As you get to the book of Revelation, that serpent is now a dragon. The serpent has grown up and become a dragon. How did that happen? Well, the seed that was planted was Eve and Adam listening to and going along with the serpent's whisperings. When people begin to move away from the light, they then influence their children and influence their neighbors and influence their tribe and influence their city and influence their nation. And when political power is given to these bad ideas, that's when the dragon emerges, right? So, for example, Hitler, began teaching anti-Semitism and blaming the nation's problems on the Jews. And enough people bought into that, and enough people gave their allegiance and power over to Hitler. He was actually elected. Now he did some illegal things along the way, but he eventually became the legitimately elected leader. Legitimate is a stretch when you know the exact history. But anyway, the people went along with it, the German people. And I lived in Germany for 10 years. So I had the chance to experience, what it was like to be in that nation and some of the after effects of all that. Anyway, the point is, Hitler assumed political power and was the driving force behind World War II. That was the dragon waking up because enough people bought into a bad ideology and gave it power. Right. So that's how the seed that's planted grows up. That's how we plant the wind, we sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. So Bruce, what I'm really saying is this does matter, right?
Right.
This is not just theory.
Right.
It is theory, and these diagrams are interesting, and they're dense. There's a lot of information packed into them. But what you're doing is trying to educate us on underlying economic principles to help cleanse and purify our thinking around materialism, right? Materialism held in balance and equilibrium.
You want to go to the next diagram?
I want to take a break and quickly share one of the videos because we've been going on. I've been pontificating a lot. And I think the video also gives a nice insight and overview. So we're gonna share a video here about Bruce's work, and we'll be right back. Don't go anywhere.
Everyone wants a better future, but how do we get there? Throughout history, laws have been a guide, but somewhere along the way, ego and greed took control. What happens when law loses its connection to fairness and humanity? It's time to reconnect justice and freedom, to rebuild systems that support balance and prosperity for everyone. Economic justice isn't about control, it's about cooperation. And when we embrace it, incredible things happen. This book is your invitation to think differently, to see how freedom can lead to balance, and balance can lead to peace. The answers are simpler than you think. Let's find them together. Liberty and Justice of Economic Equilibrium by Bruce Koerber. Available now.
All right, so that's the book we're talking about, and so those diagrams are a part of the book. So right before the break, we had discussed these concepts at a high level and began going through Bruce's diagrams. So we're going to continue now with diagram 4.
Yes.
And let me go ahead and present again. I just shared the wrong screen. Hang on.
Okay.
Technical. Once again. There we go. Why is it so large? Oh, let me share it. No, shrink it down to.
There it is. So Ludwig von Mises puts his finger on it best. He says, the economist must never be a specialist. In dealing with any problem, he must always fix his glance upon the whole system. So that's what this is. This is a picture of the whole system. We have human spirit, transformation, law, order, justice, unity, latent and active entrepreneurship, capital structure, market, purposeful action by spiritual beings, and property rights. That's the whole picture. So that's what an economist should be helping us understand, that whole picture. So we can then go to the next diagram. This is the simple, central, vertical human spirit portion of the model. Simply and profoundly, it represents the human reality. You've got human spirit and transformation. So it's purposeful action by spiritual beings that transforms humans. And that's what we call this the human reality. That's it.
So give us a couple of examples of purposeful action. You've elsewhere talked about entrepreneurship, for example.
Yeah. Well, every act is purposeful. I think the place where we need to focus on is the fact that that we're doing it as spiritual beings. I mean, every thought, when it becomes an action or a reality by taking a step forward, that's the action that's coming from the thought, and ideally, as we grow in spirituality, those actions will be reflective of that. But even when they're not, even if we're not spiritually mature, or I guess you could call it that, you are a spiritual being, whether you recognize it or not. I mean, you're attracted to something because it reflects the names and attributes of God, or you're trying to express yourself in a way, and it's in that way is a reflection of the names and attributes of God. So every person is there when they taking an action, they are purposeful, and they're also spiritual. That's the part where we're trying to raise the awareness of that concept.
All right. So, but in that sense, let's take Star Wars, for example. You've got the Force, and then you've got the dark side of the Force, right? So purposeful action could be negative, could be going in the wrong direction,
It could
cause a negative transformation.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's possible. Sure.
So
but it's so, like, for instance, a negative could be like seeking power. Okay. But the power is the name of God. So, I mean, it's doing it in a negative way. You're seeking it for an evil, for a reason.
Well, or let's just say that one has a desire to achieve some benefit, right? Some wealth,
Right.
but one chooses, instead of working for that thing, to steal that thing, which is a
Right.
different kind of work, right? Stealing is work. Stealing is an action.
Yeah.
Right. Some thieves, work very hard at their craft, right?
Right.
But it's purposeful,
It's purposeful.
right? But again, it's transforming you in the negative way. So, and I think this gets back to some of the basic principles that you've outlined in past episodes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that we have free will, we have freedom of choice. We can, and God is kind of hands off. He's set laws in motion, principles in motion. We are allowed to plant the kind of seeds that we choose, and we reap the kind of outcomes that we've created. So when God says we're a Cancer, yes, depending on which purposeful action we take.
Yeah, there is transformation that's always taking place as a result of purposeful action, and spiritual beings is a relative term in terms of sometimes that you would call it immature, an immature spiritual being, or unenlightened spiritual being that's taking purposeful action, and it's leading to a transformation which probably has negative. Maybe not negative for them, because if they're a thief, it might be they increase their wealth, but it's negative on the effect on others is negative. So the transformation that's taking place is happening, and it has different, different outcomes. But it's always purposeful action by spiritual beings that's leading to that transformation.
Yep, I'm going back to this equilibrium slide here to
Okay.
pose another question here from Olga to you, Bruce. And
Okay.
how would divine economy theory define a fair wage?
Well, again, the as we'll see a little bit later, also the whole idea is voluntary social cooperation. Okay, so it's voluntary. Fair wage is if a person voluntarily accepts that, it's fair. But no matter what anyone else thinks, if I accept a wage, I'm doing it voluntarily. That's fair.
Right. So again, I think Olga's question, I'll try to address it this way. Some of you may be familiar with the analogy of an onion, right? And the layers of an onion, that you peel the layers of an onion off. In the end, there's nothing there. But it's been posited that in a way we live inside an onion, right? With all these layers that have been built around us. So this question of a fair wage comes from within a society that has these layers of history built upon it, right? Going back thousands of years, there was this thing called indentured servitude, right? Bruce, you're familiar with that, I'm sure, right? In which somebody would agree to work for 7 years in order to achieve something, right? And again, that could have been a voluntary thing, or you might have fallen into it as a result of some crime or some punishment or some indigence. But for example, you have in the Bible, Jacob, later Israel, working 7 years for the woman that he loved, which was Rachel. But then the person he was working for substituted his older daughter, Leah, on the wedding night. And Jacob had to work another 7 years to actually get Rachel. And he complained later that Laban had changed his wages 7 times because this kind of deception went on and on. But Jacob himself was a deceiver. The name, Jacob means heel catcher because he wanted to be the firstborn even from the womb, according to this story, to get the birthright and so on. So the Bible is full of these stories about the human condition, right? And you say, Bruce, we'll call it human reality. The problem is, as we go over time, systems of systems get built up, and the wage earner, right? Some 16-year-old, they're sovereign before God, right? But depending on what kind of family they come from, they have to make certain kinds of choices, and certain other choices are not available to them, right? You can go work at a fast food place for minimum wage, or like my daughter, she, while in high school, took some classes where there were kids with special needs, and she chose to help those kids with special needs. And she was then put in a program where she was working and supporting those children with special needs because she liked doing it and she did well with it. That ended up on her resume. So as a 16-year-old, she got a job as an aide to a family with an autistic daughter, and she's making well over minimum wage already at 16, based on having made certain decisions and certain choices. So Olga, all this is a very practical, real world example, and I'm not just sitting here. I am praising my daughter because I'm very proud of her. But we made certain choices. We helped her make certain choices, and those choices benefited her. It's not that the economic theory defines what that wage should be, but it defines that you are the agent, you are the protagonist.
Right.
you have to work your way through and make these. Am I explaining it properly, Bruce? How would you correct me about your theory here?
No, I agree. It's just basically. I think what Olga has mentioned before, the idea of slavery, that's an element in there. But when you pose it in terms of a fair wage, uh, it's fair if I agree to it. I mean, that's all there is to it. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't do it. And so I'm regarding it as fair. Whether someone else regards it as fair, I mean, that's their choice. But the person who's actually engaged in that has already decided that it's fair. So that would be how it's defined. If an individual agrees to it, it's fair. That's a contractual society, by the way.
All right. So great discussion. In the interest of time, let's move on. Do you want to move on to the next diagram, Bruce?
Sure. So here, what we're talking about is the origin of law. Law is discovered, and what we have as evidence of that is the natural sciences. Gravity was not man-made; it's a law, and it's discovered. Magnetism, that's not a man-made thing; it's discovered. And same thing with economic sciences. There's laws that can be discovered, and so what's happened over time is, as things developed, there were nobles who played the role of implementing discovered law, and so there were customs that were revolved around that. It's basically social contracts that were taking place, which moved it from a customary law to kind of a contractual law, and then that developed further and went into like what you would then call codified law, which it was still discovered law, but it was actually formalized into code. Okay, and that was the natural process. And then what came in was common law, which eventually became a privileged arena of judges and lawyers. So that in that situation, the law is not discovered; it's made. It's man-made, and then it's applied. And so we have this codified or contractual law versus common law. So in the common law is when the ego-driven interpretation and ego-driven intervention comes into the play. So if we look at this diagram, we have a series of axes. If you look at the second one from the left, okay, we're gonna say that that's going to be a contractual law, okay, and it's categorized kind of as a good law because it's agreed on. So, but if you go to the left, then it's like what happens with common law. These are man-made laws; they're arbitrary, and it moves it to the left. But then if we go back to that contractual law and we go to the next one over, that would be like codified law. And then the next level over, so the one furthest to the right is when divine laws come into place. And that would be a situation where that contract is a covenant. And that covenant is where the divine laws are discovered in that area. So what we see over time is this ever advancing civilization. If you have rotten laws, the economy suffers. It moves to the left. And if you have contractual laws, and then even if you go and then codified laws, and then divine laws, the civilization and the economy advances. So that's what that shows. So what I wanted to talk to you about is the 10 principles of classical liberalism. So what we have, I'll just mention what they are. So the first principle is life. The life of each individual is an absolute and universal moral, and has absolute and universal moral value. And the second principle is property rights or human rights. The third principle is that they're God-given rights. They're not given by man, they're God-given. The fourth principle of classical liberalism is economic liberty. And the fifth principle is self-defense. The sixth principle is limited government. The seventh principle is free speech and freedom of religious belief. The eighth principle is free trade. And the ninth principle is non-prejudice. And the 10th principle is an ever-advancing civilization. So I would go into each one of those, but I was, for sake of time, I just wanted to mention them. Do you want me to go into more detail or mention them again?
No. I'd like to again objectify this practically. So,
okay.
If we look at the founding of this nation, you and I are in America. I've actually lived in 7 countries. I'm proud of that in a way, in that it allowed me to look at things from another perspective.
Mm-hmm.
In today's world, we have a lot of people talking about my truth, right? People want to share their truth. I don't like that formulation. I think it's a flawed formulation to talk about one's own truth. I don't think such a thing exists. Truth is truth, and you don't have your own version of it. Your own version of truth is not truth, right? Your version of truth is false, right? So if I say my truth, by definition, I should be saying my fantasy. I say that my fantasy is this, right? This is how I interpret the world. A more neutral way of saying it is my perspective, right? I don't like, so if you come at me with your truth, I'll probably stop you and say, well, your truth is not truth. Right? Sorry, pal, or gal, or whatever you believe you are. Your truth is not truth. Your truth is your perspective. You have a right, and I honor and respect your perspective, but don't ask me to acknowledge it as truth, because it's no more truth than what I believe. Right? So living in 7 countries has given me the ability to look at the elephant from multiple sides, right? Why do I bring up that background? Would you say, Bruce, that the founding fathers of this nation got many of those principles right, that they built those principles into the fabric of our Constitution, the fabric of our nation?
Yeah.
So any injustices that arose were either because we didn't follow, because we were hypocrites, right? We didn't actually do what we said, right? So slavery, for example, absolutely hypocritical to what we proclaimed in the founding of this nation. Right. And lo and behold, the fabric of this nation was ripped apart over that error in the Civil War, right? To abolish slavery. It ripped this nation apart. It was such a fundamental hypocrisy that it had devastating consequences, and more men died in that war than any other in this nation's history. To correct that flaw, that error of hypocrisy that was accepted by society, right? Having said that, still the fabric of this nation's Constitution was an achievement in that ever advancing civilization, was it not?
Right. Yeah. They were inspired by the classical liberalism thought that came from Western civilization of Europe. That's where they were getting the foundation of their understanding of what a good society would look like. So they basically were trying to implement these principles of classical liberalism, and they've been now, made clear what they are and put forth, and they can. I think it's pretty much a good foundation for a contractual society.
All right, so let's move on, shall we, then, to the next diagram? Do you want to do that?
Diagram 7, yeah. So basically, that diagram, this one here, basically just shows you how it all fits the the principles of classical liberalism fit into this idea of economic equilibrium. So we have the balancing of liberty and justice. On the liberty side, with economic liberty, we have life, property rights, God-given rights, freedom of speech and faith, and self-defense. On the justice side, we have the free market, we have limited government, we have non-prejudice, and then that whole area, that's then balancing on this liberty and justice, which causes the carrying forward of an ever-advancing civilization. So again, this economic equilibrium fits right into the idea of classical liberalism and the balancing of this liberty and justice, like we had earlier. But this puts then the principles of classical liberalism into that formula.
So I want to reintroduce, and Olga, by the way, thank you so much for these comments. I think it's really interesting that you're sharing these perspectives and helpful to us and to the audience. And I apologize to other audience members that were focusing on Olga's thread here, but it's almost like a little bit of a fencing match or a tennis match between the perspective that Olga's sharing and the one that we're explaining here. This gets back to that whole fair wage thing, right? I don't think they decide it's fair. They decide to accept because there's no other choice. I don't believe that's true, Bruce. Do you believe that it's true that there's no other choice than to accept that wage?
Well, they could always choose not to. So, I mean, that's a choice. Everything you do, if you make a choice, you're making it because that's what you think is best for you. So that's, I mean, so that would be fair. I mean, if you choose not to do it, then your wage is zero, and that's a fair wage, or that's what you choose. You're making a decision about what path to pursue. If you make that choice, how can anyone say that you're not being fair in your choices? I mean, it's basically it's someone else trying to decide for another person, and that's not. If we're talking fairness, that kind of goes overboard on that. I mean, let me ask Olga this question: if you made a choice, and someone said that choice is not a fair choice, how would you feel? I mean, I think that you would say, well, I made the choice based on my knowledge of the circumstances, my personal what's best for me. So it's not fair for you to judge me. So I would say there's fairness on the other side that we're not looking at.
Well, so I think the issue here again, and this is why I brought up the onion analogy, right? You're living inside many layers of an onion, and there's probably a better analogy than that. But let me give a practical example. When I mentioned my daughter earlier. Well, guess what? My daughter's about to turn 17. When I was 17, when I was a junior in high school, I ended up living in a tent in Alaska. So my senior year of high school, I was tent boy. And what that meant was the weather was 20 degrees below zero, right? This is Alaska we're talking about. And I'm living in a tent with no water and no electricity. You might think I'm making this up or exaggerating. I am not. My choices were like this. I had some flexibility. I could choose which classes to take. I chose to take PE first thing in the morning so I could get a shower. And when I came out of the shower, I had to put on my tent clothes and I could smell what I smelled like, right? From living in the tent in these clothes. And then I had the opportunity because I was able to drive this old 1966 Chevy pickup into Anchorage, and I managed to get a job walking a picket line for the Teamsters Union, and Safeway, the grocery store chain, had a union bakery. And so they were protesting. This is an interesting example that I chose, actually, coincidentally. They were protesting against the wages that the bakers were earning, and the Teamsters were hiring other people because those bakers had a choice to not walk the picket line. They didn't want to be the ones to have to walk the picket line. So the Teamsters Union paid other people to walk the picket line. So I went from living in a tent, went to school, took my PE class, followed by government civics, right, which was the only requirement I needed to graduate from high school. And then I drove into Anchorage an hour to spend 8 hours walking outside with a picket sign outside of Safeway, because I made more money. The Teamsters being a union shop, they paid a decent wage, 2 or 3 times minimum wage to people walking that picket line. So as a 17-year-old, I was making good money. And I'm answering this question in the backdrop of this slide because it's this balance of liberty and freedom and justice. God gives us free will, right? God does not force the structure of society. He doesn't make our choices for us. He doesn't dictate what the wage should be. Even though some of us might try to dictate that, God doesn't. So in this freedom to establish, the ever advancing civilization, right, to move from the rotten laws to the divine laws, it's being done on this fulcrum of liberty and justice. So here I am walking the picket line in 20 below weather in Anchorage, Alaska. My tent was in Palmer, right? And there on the picket line was this lovely woman. I'm now trying to remember her name. I can't remember her name, but I can picture her. And this is decades ago. And she had a German accent, I believe. I didn't speak German at the time, and she was telling me, you should apply for Safeway. Right?
Yeah.
They are opening a new store and they pay good wages. Right? So I went from walking the picket line against Safeway, and I crossed the picket line that I was walking to go get a job with Safeway. And this is really a good example here because someone is deciding that Safeway is unfair, right? That they're not paying fair wages. But from my perspective, from my vantage point, I left the Teamsters who were picketing against Safeway to go work for the enemy because they paid me more for better conditions than the Teamsters Union, who was setting themselves up as the judge of what was fair. Now, is that not an interesting set of circumstances in this context?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
now we have these various layers of the onion, and we also have the multiple perspectives somewhere on this liberty and justice fulcrum. I live in particular circumstances. Now, I could howl at the moon and blame everybody else and claim that I'm a victim and that I'm being taken advantage of and that I don't have choices. And somebody else would say, well, yeah, you were able to do that because you were white and you were privileged, even though I was living in a tent in 20 below weather. And somebody else of a different set of circumstances, racial or otherwise, would not have had the opportunities that I had. But one of the principles that used to be common sense is that, look, you have to play the hand you're dealt.
Right.
So, Bruce, what are your comments on that example, of this idea of what's a fair wage and the divine economic theory, and whether or not people have a choice because they have no other choice? I think you always have choices.
Yeah, I noticed Olga also had a comment about her perception of voluntary as to be willing to do something without being forced. And that's what we're talking about. I mean, people are making their choices, and they're the ones that earlier the comment was the idea about individual sovereignty. Well, that's what that's all about. A person is sovereign. They make decisions that affect themselves, and they make their choice voluntarily, and they're sovereign, so they have the right to do that. And someone else who's outside of that, basically passing judgment on that, they don't really have the right or to have expectations on a sovereign individual. That individual made their choice, and they did it because they believe they wouldn't have done it if they didn't think it was fair to themselves. So I think this is kind of an issue that's basically not understanding sovereignty and of the individual.
Well, you know, to fast forward years later, I graduated from college, you know, because I realized Safeway wasn't enough for me. And I saved my pennies and I got out of Alaska. And in the meantime, I had to struggle with the fallout of all the challenges that I'd had. You know, to be blunt and honest, I was borderline drug addicted, right? I wasn't. I had been granted strong will, whether that's my family upbringing, my DNA, or the fact of some religious training that I had when my dad joined this church when I was 11, to make up my own mind, and also to trust in God, that God would be with me and help me through the trials and difficulties. But I was still stumbling and succumbing to drug use and alcohol use. And I looked at my miserable circumstances even after I got that job with Safeway, and I was earning good money. But then I was in trouble with the police because of my driving habits and bad choices. I was making some good, some bad, some good, some bad choices, right? And I managed to get to college in California, and I graduated, and I'm now in Germany, and I'm working in an office, and I'm the assistant to the regional. I'm assistant to the office manager of the German-speaking region of this nonprofit religious organization. And they had a canteen. It was called a canteen, but basically, you know, they provided food for the employees. They had a kitchen down in the basement, and Tante Minchen, Aunt Minchen, she was called, was the cook, and she would cook for us. Now, she was raised in the Soviet Union, in Russia. And I was then studying Russian. It's another story. And I learned the word davai, which is hurry up. And so I was walking behind, I came up on the street behind Tante Minchen one day, and this was just out, I just happened to. And I came up behind her and I said, davai, davai, like hurry up, hurry up. And for me, I was just like, you know, kind of teasing her. And she almost had a heart attack, because it reminded her of her life in the Soviet Union, where guess what? She was under full lockdown and coercion, and the Russians would come up behind you and say, davai, davai, like, hurry up, move it, you know, and it was a threat of death. And she almost had a heart attack right there on the street. And she wanted to turn her, when she saw it was me, she just wanted to smack me for having done that to her, right? Because her circumstances involved a whole lot more centralized control of the economy and determining what, quote, fair wages were, right? And a whole lot less of the freedom part, right? A whole lot less of the, I'm sharing this again now, of the liberty part, which ended up with a whole lot less of the justice part. True justice, right? Because there was no free market. There was not limited government. There were no property rights, because in communism, right, the ideology is you don't own property, right? So anyway, Olga's saying my Russian is perfect. Thank you. You know, and I knew enough to get in trouble, Olga. So anyway, Bruce, your thoughts, your comments on this whole sort of objectifying your theories here and talking about the real world implications.
You're excellent at doing that. That's all I can say. I appreciate it so much.
Well, I have diverse life experiences, I mentioned, living in different countries, to give me the perspective on this. I mean, when I was in Sweden as a child, 4th and 5th grade, you know, the Russian Soviet team was playing hockey against Sweden, which was the humanitarian superpower. We thought, you know, self-righteously virtue signaling their excellence to the world. And then Canada was another great hockey nation, and I was born in Canada. So, you know, Sweden, Russia, and Canada being in the Olympic hockey, you know, that was whole lot more interesting than, you know, the Bronx playing the Packers right here in America, right? Because there was this ideological warfare being played out on the hockey stage that I, as a you know, as a 9 and 10-year-old could feel viscerally, could experience that this was an ideological clash that meant something. So yeah, I've been interested in this topic for many decades. And I just love, Bruce, how you have objectified it in these theoretically beautiful diagrams.
Okay, that's good. We can go to the next one then. Ah, that is not it though.
Which one are you looking for?
8.
This is what I have for 8.
Oh, okay.
What is it supposed to be? Let me see if I can quickly.
Well, maybe we're missing that one. I guess I don't see it on there.
But maybe it's this one.
That's it there. Yeah.
Okay.
So justice must be weighty to permit the divine economy, the divine microeconomy, and the ethics of economics to operate in a human civilization. In other words, justice must reign supreme in this period of human history when the human reality is fully protected. So we have the weightiness of justice. It counterbalances the whole situation of liberty here with the divine economy, divine microeconomy, and ethics. And on this side, we have the justice. And so justice, it ultimately protects the human reality, and liberty allows for the expression of the human reality. And in protected, the human spirit acts purposefully and undergoes transformation. Anything that interferes with this process is unjust. So that's why this justice is it's got to, in this period of history, it's the thing that must reign supreme, because it counterbalances all the elements of liberty, and it is what allows the human spirit to undergo transformation.
Well, and allow me to give an example, another practical example of this based on my experience.
Okay.
So Jesus, obviously he brought an advancement. There's an Old Testament scripture which says he shall magnify the law and make it honorable, right? Moses was the lawgiver, you know, in the Bible, and Jesus fulfilled that prophecy of magnifying the law and making it honorable. And that is a process that is ongoing in the eternal covenant. Would you agree, Bruce?
Yeah.
So what I'm getting at now is that Jesus said, you must forgive, right? So I'm going to take an extreme example, a rape, right?
Okay.
The person who is raped, most usually a woman, but not always, the person who is raped must forgive the rapist. But society must punish the rapist, right? Must intervene, must take action. That's on the liberty and justice scale there, right? Mm-hmm. Your liberty does not extend to raping another human being. And justice demands action, intervention, right?
Right.
You can't be laissez-faire about rape in society. Would you agree?
That's true.
Right? So, but the point is, Jesus commands us to forgive at the individual level. But as we build a civilization, we assign the responsibility of intervention to the government, to the legal system. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
And as we have an ever advancing society, it becomes more complex. And again, this little balancing thing of liberty and justice here is a theoretical illustration of that principle. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's a good example that you're giving of how the justice part again is very weighty. It's something that is ultimately the the, the strongest force that takes place in the economy, I mean, in the civilization to keep things balanced. The liberty part allows the expression, and the justice protects those individuals to act, so that they can act and so that they can transform.
All right, should we move on to the last slide?
Sure. So in this environment of liberty and justice, the ultimate end, which is the ultimate end is social cooperation, and it's attained again and again as the process of an ever-advancing civilization. So what you see is this axis just keeps moving along as there's more and more social cooperation, and then as that advances, that the economy advances and the civilization advances. And this social cooperation is dependent on the balancing of liberty and justice. So that's what enables. You can see the axis there of justice and unity, or basically it's telling the same story about the weightiness of justice. It brings about unity, and that's also allowing this expression of liberty to take place. And so that as that moves along, then the economy can advance and civilization will advance due to social cooperation taking place at higher and higher levels.
And if we look at the broad sweep of history, we see the rise and fall of empires, right? The rise and fall of civilizations, the springtime of growth and vibrancy, and the winter of death and desolation.
Well, yeah, and I think the promise, though, is what we're talking about is that when we have the divine laws that are found, discovered as a result of the contractual situation with the covenant, then we don't necessarily see history repeating itself in the same way, because the covenant, which is this contract, is inviolable. So it has a different kind of a effect on the advancement of civilization. The civilization actually reaches the climax of a divine civilization as a result of the contract, which is unique in human history. This covenant that will enable the divine civilization to actually come into existence rather than just pieces of it like it did in the past. So I think the rise and fall of civilization what is a direct result of a weak covenant, whereas now this is a strong, inviolable covenant. So that will enable the divine civilization to come into full fruition at some point.
Well, so here lip sync is describing it as same ice cream, different flavor, which is an interesting way of expressing what I was feeling, which is that you said it, it's not happening in the same way, and I would agree, not exactly the same way, but according to your diagram, it is. It's the imbalance of unity and justice, right? It's the imbalance of liberty and justice. It is, the imbalances of some of these 10 principles, right? That is the cause of the decline and the collapse of that civilization. So it's different versions of the same phenomenon happening.
Well, except that what I'm mentioning here is that we're living in a different period in human history where the two problems that have caused all the social diseases, social problems, are ego-driven interpretation and ego-driven interventionism, and both of those through the means of science and the means of religion have been abolished. Now, whether it's going to take a while for mankind to realize that and to understand that, but that's the truth of the matter, that those two things have been abolished, so that their effect on this rising and falling of civilization will be basically disappear.
Well, to the degree that people follow the law, right? Because you can abolish all you want. There's an interesting comment. I'll go back to it here and there are many comments we've skipped over. Again, we can't go through all of them, but it's an interesting comment here by Mackay. The 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. It was a mirage that marked its continual usage by using the word except. Today, slavery is known as the prison industrial complex. That's a deep topic for another day. But I wanted to honor that submission in the comment section. But my point is, you can pass a law; it doesn't mean people will follow it, and doesn't mean that the society will follow its own rules. We recently had a president pardon his son, and the Justice Department of his own administration wasn't happy about that, right? And we recently had an election in which it was said that nobody is above the law, and it was the side that's currently in power that was using that argument arguing against the election of the other side. But now that same side is illustrating that, well, when it comes to us and ours, we are above the law, right? So my point is that you can make laws, and we'll go back to your slide about the rotten laws and the good laws. The way in which humanity responds to those manifestations, to those epochs, to those eras, one could argue it doesn't change, right? Because you could go back to Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, right? And the days of Noah. And then it says in the last days, the days that we're living in now, it will be just like the days of Noah. That's a biblical prophecy that the day we're living in today will have people in it that are just like they were in Noah's day. So the fact that this or that was abolished in this phase of God's advancing revelation doesn't necessarily mean that society will respond in a given way.
Well, they really don't have much choice, because the two most powerful forces in human civilization are science and religion. Now, I think it's where we are right now. Science is not understood, and religion is not understood. Science has been manipulated, and it's in a weak condition, and so is religion. And a lot of that is because of this ideology of statism. But what happens basically is those are the two most powerful forces, and both of those, both the science, I'm talking about the divine economy theory here, that's an economic science, the science and the religion both have freed mankind from the ego-driven aspects of
in theory, right? So I'm agreeing with you, Bruce, but again, the practical example, let's go back to the one I raised a little while ago, which was the serpent that grows up to be the dragon, right? Because science and religion was already there in the Garden of Eden. The knowledge of the tree of good and evil and the tree of life could easily represent science and religion, right? Because Paul said that strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. That's science, right? And he's implying, he's referring back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The desire to become wise, to take to oneself the prerogative of deciding what is good and evil. That is science. Ultimately, true science. But of course, today there's a fun quote, which is, they told me to follow the science, right? That was the mantra during COVID, follow the science. They told me to follow the science. I followed the money, and that's how I found the science, right? Because the science was whatever the money told it to be, right?
Yeah.
So
Wow.
you're right.
Yeah.
We don't have purity of science. And on the flip side, you've got this great quote from the Tablet of Ahmad, just amazing quote that is so powerful, in which it says, "Thus have their superstitions become veils between themselves and their own hearts," right? So a pure heart that might actually be discovering science could still succumb to superstition, which is a religious ideology, a religious belief divorced from science, right? Superstition. So again, one of your slides holding the true balance of science and religion, to use these things together to attain objectivity, to attain wisdom, to remove the veils of superstition, and also to overcome the temptation of materialism, right? To use two examples. But we're doing it incredibly imperfectly. So to me, and this is why I referenced the serpent and the dragon in this context, it's not, it is absolutely, you're absolutely right that if, when Moses brought something, when Abraham brought something, when Jesus brought something, it ushered in a new era. When Baha'u'llah brings something, it ushers in a new era. But the point I'm making is, another way of looking at it is, it's simply scale. It's scale. Cain and Abel were two brothers, right? The Soviet Union and the United States, in their space race in the 50s, are the seed that was planted, if you will, by Cain and Abel. Imperfect analogy, but you get my point. It's a matter of scale. It's as more as we fulfill the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, and fail to keep the commandment of dress and keep the garden, the species aggregates up at this scale, and we create these layers of family, of village, of tribe, of city, of school, of state, of nation, of federated nation, right? The United States is a federation of 50 states. A state was the word for nation. When the United States were founded, it was like France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy deciding to have a federal government. That only came many decades later with the so-called United States of Europe, right? The European Union and the Soviet Union and the United States of America. This is a scale issue. You follow me? And so abolishing this, abolishing that, those teachings are appropriate at the scale at which we have arrived in our evolution, if you will.
There's complementary things happening, though. The society is changing and becoming more educated and more aware and more spiritual, and so are the individuals. So they're working; those things are happening at the same time. So
I would argue that society is not becoming more spiritual right now.
Okay,
it's a matter
right now. But again, like I was saying earlier, that the ideology of statism prevents it causes the atrophying of ethics. So as that is wiped out or realized that it's harmful, then the ethics of humans changes. Okay, that's at the broad scale, but then at the individual level, that's happening also. So you have this happening at the level of the individual. You have it happening at the level of society or civilization. So those things together are helping the whole process move forward. I mean, it's not something that happens instantly, of course, but it doesn't reverse.
No, the prophecy is through much travail, right? Through much travail. For example, America will, what is it? Undivided and undefeated. Through much travail, America will lead the world to the most great peace, right? We're in that travail portion, right? I would argue that since the Enlightenment, we've become less spiritual. Now, that is, on the one hand, because we're shedding superstition, right? But I've also said we simply lurch forward from ditch to ditch, right? And we cross the center of the road for a brief instant as we're heading towards the other ditch. There's this philosopher named Ken Wilber. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He had this. He devoted his life to studying all the world's philosophies and systems, and he came up with this model called all levels, all quadrants. And what it is it's kind of like the helix, the DNA helix, but it's square. And he described it by imagining 4 colors, right? Blue, yellow, red, and green. I think it was, whatever, doesn't matter. But blue and red is interesting because of the political divide in our country. So let's go with that for a moment. I don't know if that corresponds exactly to his model. I'm familiar with it, but I'm not a student of it really. But this I know, and this is, in my opinion, really true. So in order to move forward, in order to advance, you have to leave the error, right? You have to repent in religious terms. Repent means turn around and go the other way. That's what it means. Repent. Leonard Cohen asked that question in one of his songs. When they said repent, I wonder what they meant. It's a great song, but it means turn around and go the other way. So in order to leave the red, you won't go towards the blue, right? So you go towards the green or whatever. You go sideways, you tack into the wind. And then you have to go towards the other before you come around to the third corner. And then you ultimately come back to red, but you're at a higher level of red. You follow me? So you're advancing by moving away from one thing. And I describe it in binary terms of expansion and consolidation. And I've shared this before. Adam brought an expansion dispensation, be fruitful and multiply. Mm-hmm. Noah brought a consolidation dispensation after Adam. I will destroy everybody. And now there were 8 people left. Abraham brought an expansion. Leave your father and mother and go to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you the father of many nations. If you can count the stars of the sea, if you can count the sand on the seashore, that's how many your descendants will be. Expansion. Then, the Israelites end up in Egypt, and it's a consolidation. Come out of Egypt, depart from her, let her plagues be upon her, let her sin be upon you, and I will make you a shining city on a hill. Now, this is bigger than Noah, but it's still a consolidation. It's the consolidation around strict legalism and adherence to laws. Now you have Jesus, which is 2 laws: love God, love your neighbor, and preach the gospel to the whole world. Now you have a massive expansion again. You follow me? So it's like breathing in and breathing out as this scale, as you're advancing civilization, advances. It's done in that way. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You follow me? But it's a matter of scale, and we're responsive to a degree, but we pass the truth of God on our way to the other ditch, and then God has to bring us back. And that doesn't stop. And for Baha'is, and again, this is just my perspective. We're all entitled to interpret it, right, and have our perspective. It's not my truth, it's my perspective. There will be never-ending cycles of this where we haven't arrived, and we won't arrive for 500,000 years. And to think we've arrived now, this gets back to a question, right? Where are we at? Olga, said, are we already living in the divine civilization? Here we go. So do we already live in the divine economy?
Well, the divine economy is the reality. We just don't know about it. We're trying to learn about it. That's how the world works. I mean, the divine economy is basically the providence of God. You know, one of the things I was saying is the core understanding of the divine economy is trust in God, because God gave that to us, and that's how we can become prosperous and build the divine civilization each time. I mean, it's emphasized each time and particularized each time by the manifestation of God, but it never went away. I mean, when God created humanity in his image, the part of that providence was the divine economy. That's what it is. It's the means to bring about the ends, and the ends is the divine civilization.
So I would submit that the Garden of Eden, yes, already had the divine economy. You had liberty and justice. You said, you can, I will let you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but don't do it, because when you do it, if you do it, you're going to die. Right? And the day you eat thereof, you will die. And I'm offering you eternal life. And man said, no, we're going to do it this way. We want the school of hard knocks. And to me, to oversimplify, that was always God's intent. He wanted us. If you think about it, that's what Jesus did. It says he thought it not robbery to be equal with God. He lowered himself and became as one of us. So the spirit in us, being created in God's image, this is kind of an epiphany summary. And Bruce, thank you. I mean, you bring so much of this to light with the way that you've put this model together, and it encourages this kind of discussion. And now I'm realizing that's what it means to be created in the image of God, to be put in the Garden of Eden. That's exactly what happened to Jesus. It says he was immaculately conceived, right? Mary was a virgin. He was the Son of God. And he typified our experience. He made himself as one of us, and he suffered enormously, unjustly crucified, died on the cross, and all the while a sacrificial lamb, dying in our stead for our sins, holding out the promise of divine, complete, unconditional forgiveness, illustrating and manifesting complete and unconditional forgiveness, breathing new life into all creation, as the Baha'i writings describe what he did. But that's what happened in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve chose the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God says, the day you do that, you're going to die. And then he pronounces these curses, as they're called. And I don't really believe they're curses, they're just outcomes, right, for Adam and Eve. Now that you've chosen this path, this is what it's going to look like for you. You're going to be not happy with the minimum wage that you have, that you feel like you have to choose. You're not going to be happy that you're living in a tent in Alaska and that you're walking the picket line in this crazy mixed up situation where the Teamsters are hiring you and you'd rather work for the company that they're protesting against. You're going to be in this upside down Alice in Wonderland situation, right? Caught in the riptide, figuring it out on your own, trying to apply the laws of God in a world where you must love your fellow human beings, you must be your brother's keeper, you must build a society built on unity, but the people will be your biggest challenge, your biggest problem. Other people will be the biggest thorn in your side, and yet your mission impossible, should you choose to accept it, is to do just that. I don't know. What those are my concluding thoughts for tonight, Bruce. What do you have to share here at the end?
Well, I'm just going to say that the divine economy theory has a role to play in the spiritual, social, and intellectual development of individuals for many reasons. First of all, it's comprehensive of all disciplines. You saw that divine civilization image, and it encompassed it all.
So you're the Ken Wilber of economics. You've put it all together.
What?
I was talking about Ken Wilber and his all quadrants, all level. You're the Ken Wilber of economics. You've put it all together.
Yeah. Well, the divine economy theory is comprehensive of all disciplines from its very beginning to its end. And it's all about creating an environment of liberty and justice so that the flow of knowledge is always at its maximum. That's the thing that happens, though. This knowledge is infinite. Humanity only knows a bit of it, but they're always going to know more and more. But for that flow to happen, it has to be free to flow. And that's why the divine economy theory is so powerful, because it shows that you have to eliminate the intervention so that the flow of knowledge will happen, so that ethics can change, people can develop ethically. And that development ethically will be supported also by the structure of society as it learns, what's proper and what's not.
And Crackers, who's made a few comments over the course of this show, is saying, I'm not positive, Will. I would invite you to unpack that a little further and we can address it. Meanwhile, we're way over time, but Bruce, this was so, for me, fascinating and energizing and inspiring to just dig into this fundamental view that you've put together. So thank you for that. I just couldn't stop. But while Crackers thinks about unpacking this, explain what you're not positive it will. Okay, give me more, and we'll address that in a second. Meanwhile, I'm going to play the sneak peek for next week's show, so we'll get that out of the way. Here it is. Hello, everyone. It's Wade Fransson. I'm here in the studio recording a sneak peek for episode 128, airing December 10th. And I have Paul Hanley here. Paul Hanley lives in the 50th state, the Jubilee state here in America, in Hawaii. He's not actually on the Garden Island. He's on Molokai. But he knows a thing or two about a verse that you may have heard of from Isaiah 35, the desert shall blossom like a rose. Welcome to the studio, Paul.
Well, thanks for having me, Wade. Good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. And I'm so excited because this is a prophecy verse that I've been familiar with since my childhood. And you actually know a thing or two about the fulfillment of this verse, i.e., the Holy Land has indeed blossomed like a rose from its desert origins that began centuries ago, but even up until the last century in the 1800s, 2 centuries ago even, it was a desolate place. And tell us where your interest came from and why you wrote a book about this topic.
Well, I have been interested in agriculture just as a gardener since my youth. In my teenage years, for some reason, I picked up gardening as a hobby, and I really loved the way you could transform bare land into this productive, beautiful place where you could go out and pick gigantic heads of broccoli and cauliflower, and it seemed almost like a miracle to me, the way gardening worked. So I got really excited about it, but also at the same time got excited about a movement to create more sustainable forms of agriculture. And I got sort of jumped into that and started working on building an organic farming movement in Saskatchewan, where I grew up.
Well, and you wrote a book called 11, which deals with the climate crisis and population growth. And this book got some notoriety, positively speaking. But specifically, your recent book, Odyssea, is about the Holy Land and activities by a group of people that began there in the 1800s. Tell us about that book.
Well, I've been working on this for a few years and studying this place called Odyssea, which became a model village in Jordan. I mean, originally Palestine and Jordan were kind of one unit, and Jordan was a place where it was close to the Jordan River, obviously, and the Sea of Galilee, which are so significant in religious history for Jews and Christians, and also for Muslims. And I was interested that Abdu'l-Baha, who was the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, decided to start a village in Jordan, close to the Jordan River, close to the Sea of Galilee. And this village actually became a model village for the country of Jordan. And when the king would bring delegations from other countries and want to show them what was happening in terms of agriculture, he'd bring them to Adasiyah. And it became really a model village, even for the kibbutz movement in Israel, or what would become Israel. The kibbutz members would come to Adasiyah and see how they did things and take those practices back to their kibbutzes in Israel. So it was kind of both for the Israelis and the Jordanians, it became a really great example of turning the desert into a garden.
Well, I actually was on a kibbutz in 1981 at Ramat Rachel when I was on the City of David archaeological expedition. I have an intense interest in this, and you, audience, should also have an intense interest in this. You do not want to miss episode 128, airing December 10th at 8 p.m. on Created in the Image of God. We've just scratched the surface of the vibrant soil. We've just looked at the tip of the iceberg. We've just picked one apple, one avocado, or one pistachio off the tree. But in this episode, we will dive deep into the prophecy of Isaiah and what happened in the Holy Land and the role that Abdu'l-Baha and the Baha'i community in particular played in the fulfillment of these prophecies. Can't wait to see you there. Be there. Looking forward to that one. You don't want to miss it, 8 p.m. Central Time. So Bruce, a couple more comments that came in while we were showing that sneak peek. Cracker's comment was in reference to the last 3 or 4 comments that, the divine economy theory, as Olga summarized it, would, eliminate intervention and selfishness, I think is what you had said. So Cracker's is saying, yeah, I'm not so sure. I'm not positive that this economy will function in the way that it's intended. And again, I'm submitting here that it's an issue of scale, that it's an issue of complexity, and that the flaws, the hypocrisy, right, the corruption of government are what tanks the economy. And again, America has been a leader in economic terms, the economic locomotive and engine of the world, and our policies, our export of Coca-Cola and McDonald's and powdered infant formula to Africa in pursuit of economic gain, right? Teaching people not to breastfeed their babies and to instead buy the powdered formula as though that's somehow better, and with flashy ads. And I'm oversimplifying here. I don't mean to attack any one segment. Cigarettes and the movies that glamorize immoral behavior, and on and on and on. I could go. All of these things are different forms of that corruption of the balance of liberty and justice around those 10 principles.
Yeah, I think atheism and statism are the big hurdles that are going to have to be jumped over. And,
so define statism in this context.
What?
Define statism for us in this context.
Well, it's a myth. It's a belief that people can't accomplish things through voluntary social cooperation, that they need someone to orchestrate it for them.
Got it.
That's a myth. So it's a superstition. We're supposed to get rid of these superstitions. That's a superstition.
Well, and this is where, and again, not to pick on Olga, because Olga, you're awesome, and I love that you're here. But going back to that comment that started a lot of this discussion around what is a fair minimum, how do you define a fair wage, right? inherent is in that statement is hypocrisy, right? Fair wage, who gets to be the arbiter and the decider of what is a fair wage? And I know that when I was trying to get a homeless foundation going in Chennai, India, that had 10 million people, 2 million homeless, 400,000 homeless children. It's a long story. When I was on my Mother Teresa phase, trying to find out where God is working after I had resigned from the ministry, I ended up through a series of fortunate or unfortunate events, to quote Lemony Snicket. I ended up in India, in Madras, Chennai. What I realized was, I'll oversimplify here. It's oversimplified, but it's nonetheless true. The homeless children could go work in a tea factory, which is basically forced child labor. But they were the lucky ones, because the unlucky ones, they ended up in the sex trade. Those were the choices that they were facing. Who's to blame? Who are you going to blame for that? Where are you going to point the finger? Where are you going to get up on your social justice warrior high horse, right? And point the finger? You know, because guess what? Working in a factory making iPhones or Nike sneakers would have been preferable. And you can blame the government, what, for not providing jobs for these 2 million homeless people in a city of 10 million? Who are you going to blame for the failure of economy? Who are you going to blame in China for the millions of people that starved to death because the centralized planning of the agriculture collapsed based on the lack of the free flow of information, because people didn't want to report bad news up the chain of government, because they were misrepresenting data and statistics to a centralized organization of control and authority that was trying its darndest, probably with good intent, to serve the needs of the people. And they were probably, recoiling in horror from the evils of capitalism and a more free market, where we also have homeless problem. But guess what? We don't have millions of people dying of starvation because we couldn't produce enough food. But we do have homelessness. We do have drug addiction. We have all kinds of other evils and social evils. This is perhaps where you would say, Bruce, it's a different variation, but the themes are the same, right? Of not balancing liberty and justice.
Yeah, and the human civilization equilibrium is broad. So the fact, and I think one of the points that I can make here is that what I was saying earlier, that when there is the ideology of statism in place, then morals atrophy. So that ethical part of that equilibrium balance, that plane of equilibrium, it's way out of balance. And so you're going to have all kinds of social issues that result from the lack of ethics. And the lack of ethics is related to the interference with the equilibrium by interventionism, by the ideology of statism. So you can't cure these things if you don't stop what's disrupting the or this imposing things on top of that are disrupting the equilibrium. You have to stop the disruptions.
Which gets back to what you said, Bruce, earlier about religion and science, right? That in this day, those two things are being called out, and in that sense purified. Our attention is being drawn to them, and we do have more tools at our disposal, more knowledge, more enlightenment. Secrets in that sense have been revealed and unveiled that could enable us, should we choose to do so. There's that word choice again. Right. Well, Bruce, just thank you.
Thank you.
And this concludes the 5-part series, and I'm glad we took extra time. But for the audience, rest assured, Bruce and I will be talking about where we go next, and we will have Bruce back, I am sure, to the degree that you're willing, Bruce. I want to also pre-announce, this is the first announcement, we're in December now, we will be rebranding and relaunching this show in January. And I'm just sneak peek for those of you, those faithful of you who are still here, all 86 of you still out there in the audience, down from whatever it was, 150, 200 at the peak. Thank you. Here's the sneak peek. Created in the image of God will stay the same. But rather than the role of religion in society, which is broad, vague, theoretical, I'm honing in on something much more specific. So here's the new theme. You're the first to know. Created in the image of God, building vibrant communities through intellectual coherence and spiritual commitment. That is the new branded theme. We're working up the new, intro video. And we've got 5 core topics that we'll be exploring over the whole course of the year, all focused on the independent investigation of reality.
Good.
Created in the image of God, building vibrant communities through intellectual coherence and spiritual commitment. And we'll be addressing this through the lens of the individual investigation of reality, the independent investigation of reality through both religion and science. So anyway, we're very excited about where we're going. We're excited about some of the guests we have lined up. We're excited about the transition into that and a number of new things that we're doing. We will also be inviting you to become more involved. We're going to be continuing to mention the Royal Falcon Foundation and an opportunity to donate so that we can spend a little bit more on marketing and continue to grow the audience and grow the show and grow the platform. We're partnering with Planksip in Canada, which is an international media company. We're partnering with the Cameron Journal, which is a social commentary and cultural relevance platform, neither of which is religious. We got philosophy and culture on, but we're expanding then a podcast network to where we give more opportunities to our guests. So we have a whole host of things planned, and I just want to thank the guests and the loyal audience that are helping us do this and spread the word of all these wonderful guests, especially you, Bruce, tonight, for a record 5th appearance. I don't know that we've, other than Daniel Sanderson, who was a co-host, I don't think we've had anyone on that many times. And it's been a wonderful journey with you. And we will have you back again if you're open to it.
I'm open. Thank you.
Well, good night, everyone. And we'll see you all next week.